Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Ben. Feels like it's been a while since my last video, but fear not, I am back today to talk about all the books that I read in March. And I say it's been a while since my last video, but it doesn't seem very long since my last wrap up. But I think that's because I was really late with the February wrap up, and we can't make the same mistake 2 months in a row. This month I read 9 books again, which was these 7 plus 2 on my Kindle, I think driven largely by my Women's Prize mania. Well, let's call it a passion. Passion sounds a lot nicer, doesn't it? But I've been trying to get through as many of the Women's Prize books as I can before the shortlist announcement, which is only a few short weeks away now. I should say that while I'll show you which of the Women's Prize longlisted books I have read this month, I'm not going to go into too much detail about them in this video because I want to do another Women's Prize shortlist predictions video, and I'll talk about those in that video. I am not going to get through all 16 books, and I don't know why I ever considered that I might be able to do it. But I think worst case, probably going to get through 10 of them. Best case, maybe 12. We'll see how I get on over the next week or so. So I'm not 100% sure what sort of video to make because I can't rank all of the books, but I could rank the ones that I've read, or I could do a shortlist prediction based off a combination of what I've read and what I've heard about the ones that I haven't read. If you've got any ideas, let me know what you would like to see, but that'll be coming in the next few weeks. Overall, I'd say I had a really good reading month. There were some great books in the mix. The only downside maybe being that 9 is probably too many books for me to read in 1 month. When I'm reading that much in such a short space of time, I feel like I'm rushing a little bit, and when I rush, I don't really comprehend what I'm reading quite as well. And because some of these books were so good, I kind of wish I'd taken my time a little bit more and savoured them. But that's something to reflect on as I go through the rest of the year. Okay, on to the books, and the first book that I read in March was The Pachinko Parlor by Elisa, Shua, Dusapin, translated by Aneesa, Abbas, Higgins. This one is published by Daunt Books, who, gotta say, make the most beautiful books. They have these lovely French flaps. The paper quality is top notch, and their covers are always spot on. I read this one because I thought it might be in contention for the International Booker Prize, and to be honest, I'm quite sad that it didn't make the cut because I think it's a really lovely book. It was originally published in French, and it's about a French woman called Claire who has Korean, Japanese heritage, and she's going back to Tokyo to visit her grandparents, but also to just spend some time there, and she's got a job tutoring a young girl called Mieko. I don't think this is a story that we haven't heard before. This is a tale about the child of immigrants trying to balance her identity as someone who is French and trying to forge her own way in the world, but also to connect with her heritage and how she preserves the legacy of her family and her background. There is an added layer of interest in that her grandparents fled the Korean Civil War and moved to Japan half a century ago. And so while Claire's trying to connect with her Korean background, that's quite alien to her grandparents. They have forged this new identity as Koreans in Japan rather than Koreans from Korea. And she's trying to plan this trip for her and her grandparents to go back, but there's some reluctance to go along with that, that she's battling with, and you start to wonder, who is this for? Is it for her grandparents, or is it for her and her need to connect? Running in parallel with this is Claire's relationship to Mieko, who she's tutoring in French, and Mieko's mother, who has aspirations for her daughter to go off to some Swiss school, and so learning French puts her at an advantage there. And that's really interesting, right? All of these sort of swapping and traded identities going on between all of these female protagonists in the book. The writing in the book is really lovely. It's quite simple and straightforward, but it's really nice to read. There's not tons of plot. It's quite an interior book, but it definitely moves along. And I found in particular the scenes between Claire and Mieko really fun and interesting. They had a good dynamic of conversation, and it makes me want to check out Dusapin's other work. So she's had another previous novel published called Winter in Sokcho, which I think is about a town just between North and South Korea. But yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I would recommend it. It's a really quick read, and if you're looking to get more fiction in translation in your life, this is a good one to turn to. Next up, I read Women Talking by Miriam Toews. I read this because Matt and I had a bit of a project to try and watch all of the Best Picture nominees from this year's Oscars. Maybe I'm a prizeaholic, I don't know, but it was quite fun to try and tackle. We sadly didn't succeed. We watched 8 out of 10 of the films, missing out on Avatar and The Fabelmans, but we just couldn't fit in that many cinema trips in such a small space of time, especially when the cinema is so expensive now. Thanks very much, cost of living crisis. One of the films we did get to see, though, was Women Talking, an adaptation of this novel, which won Best Adapted Screenplay at the Oscars, which is really cool. This book is loosely based on a true story that happened in Bolivia, where in a Mennonite colony, which I think might be somewhat related to Mormonism, I'm not 100% sure. But in this colony, there were a group of men who were drugging and then abusing some of the women in the colony and telling them that it was the work of the devil, or it was bad dreams, or that it wasn't real, until one of them got caught. This novel is not a direct fictionalisation of that story. It changes the setting and the situation slightly. But we pick up the story while the men who committed the crimes have been arrested and taken into the city, and the rest of the men have gone to try and bail them out. And the women are sort of left to themselves to decide what they want to do. The women have given themselves 3 options. They could stay and fight, they could leave, or they could do nothing. And we're reading the minutes of the meetings between 2 families of women who are debating these options. And to be quite honest, that is it. That's the whole book. The women are literally just talking about the different things that they could do. It's quite a philosophical novel. They're talking about how they're treated as women. They're talking about morality. They're talking about their responsibility to each other and their children. And I just found it really gripping throughout. There was something about it that reminded me a little of The Good Place and the way that they explore ethics and philosophy in that show. These women are illiterate and they haven't been taught how to read and write, let alone anything about great philosophers and their philosophical theories throughout history. But I think it touches on the same sorts of existential questions and questions of morality. It is really interesting that this colony has sort of hived itself off from wider society. And so at times it can feel like you're reading something from 200 years ago, and then there's a talk of mobile phones and you're sort of snapped back into the present day and you realise that these people are living this way. I found that really interesting. I'm kind of split on what I thought of the characters. On the one hand, I thought at times some of these characters seemed pretty full-formed and they had like really clear motivations and reasons for their opinions. But on the other hand, I did at times struggle to keep track of who was who in their relationship to each other, and sometimes their opinions changed and I sort of lost the thread a little bit. There is at the start of the book a little guide to which women are from which families, and so I ended up just keeping a finger in the book at that point, and as I was reading and I wasn't sure, I just flipped back, which made it a lot easier, to be honest. And by the time I was in the flow of it and I realised, okay, this person is this woman's daughter, it was all quite straightforward to follow. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I'd really recommend reading it. It's another fairly quick and gripping read. And the film was also really good. It had a stellar cast with the likes of Claire Foy and Rooney Mara and Jessie Buckley, all doing a fantastic job in their roles as these different women. In a way, I almost wish that I'd watched the film first and then read the book, because I think that might have helped me keep track of who was who, because I could have pictured the different actresses playing the different roles. And it also helped me learn how to say some of the names, because they are not super common names. They're quite like Germanic names, because all these women don't even speak English. They speak this language called Low Germanic. The book is obviously written in English though. I've seen some criticisms of this book for being from the perspective of a character called August Epp. And the reason it's written from his perspective is because, as mentioned, all of these women don't know how to read or write. And so they have roped in a friendly man from the colony called August, who has previously left the colony, been educated outside, I think in England, and then recently rejoined the colony, I think because his parents have died. And so all of the text that we're reading is August's minutes that he's written, and it's got a lot of his own thoughts threaded into that. And some people have said that they don't like that because this is a women's story and it's being told from the perspective of a man. But I'm not quite sure that's a fair criticism. I can understand where it comes from, but for me, that was kind of part of the point of the book and its form, right? So these are women who have been disempowered by being denied a certain level of education, and so their story has to be framed through a man's perspective. I thought that was quite clever of Miriam Toews, and I think she executed it really well. One other thing that I did really enjoy about it was that it could have very easily turned into a book that was debating religion, and it could have been about we can be these oppressed women who are part of a religious group, or we can emancipate ourselves and we have to throw religion to the wayside in order to achieve that. But that was never something on the table. These women wanted the freedom to be able to practice their faith in the way that they wanted. And although I'm not a religious person myself, I think that made for a much more interesting story. It meant it was exploring a more interesting dilemma, really, which was a lot more complex than just religion bad. Overall, I really enjoyed it. I'm keen to get into more of Miriam Toews' work. I think I'd love to pick up Fight Night at some point this year. Maybe I'll wait for when that is released on paperback. And then I read The Furrows by Namwali Serpell. This is a book that has had quite a few plaudits. It's been on a few long lists and short lists for various prizes. It was on Obama's Books of 2022, and I think it was one of the New York Times notable 10 books, only 5 of which are fiction, from 2022. This book is about a young girl called Cassandra, whose brother Wayne tragically dies when they are both still kids. The book opens with the line, "I don't want to tell you what happened, I want to tell you how it felt." And indeed the first chapter is an account of how the brother died. But throughout Cassandra's narration, there is something a little bit off about some of the language. Her brother spalooshes through the water, or a hairdryer is layabouting in the bathroom. I think there's one point where a plane is teeter-tottering through the sky. And all of this adds up to create this sort of unease about the validity of what you're reading. And indeed, when Cassandra grows up, she starts to run into people who remind her a lot of her brother. And you start to question, is what was shared really true? And I love books that do that. Ones that play with your sense of what's true and what's not, and what can be trusted, and who gets to tell a story and how. And I don't really want to spoil anything beyond that. It's not a book that reveals all of its secrets. It's not tied up very neatly in a bow at the end. But I think it is a book that has a number of threads through it that are really interesting to tug on, and it probably would be one that benefits from multiple readings. There is a bit of a dividing line at the halfway point of the book, and you get something slightly different for the second half. And I know that some people have found the second half a little bit less satisfying than the first, but I still really liked it. I thought for me they were equally good, but in slightly different ways. It does get a little bit complicated at times. There will be parts of the book that make you scratch your head and wonder, is that really what's going on here? But I think the book earns that level of thought and reflection. If you've read and liked something like Trust Exercise by Susan Choi, I think you'd probably get a lot out of this book. The prose is really strong. Serpell is a great writer. I have got The Old Drift on my Kindle, but I never got round to it. I'm not sure why, but reading this has made me want to get to it at some point in the future. I had read this trying to get ahead on Women's Prize longlist reading because I thought it might be in with a shout. And although it didn't make the list, part of me wishes it did, because I have enjoyed this a little bit more than some of the other books that I've read that did make the cut. On to the women's longlist reading that I've been doing. As mentioned, I'm not going to talk about these books in detail. I'm just going to run through them quickly. But I read I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel. I've got this lovely sparkly foils edition. I read Children of Paradise by Camila Grudova. I read Cursed Bread by Sophie Mackintosh, and I actually went to see Sophie talk about this book, and she signed it and gave me a little happy croissant, which looks more like blessed bread than cursed bread, but that was fun. Wandering Souls by Cecile Pin. Or Pin. She's a French author, but this was written in English. And that is a gorgeous cover. I'm sure you will agree. I also read Fire Rush by Jacqueline Crooks, which is partly set in Bristol, which excited me quite a bit. And then finally, I read Trespasses by Louise Kennedy, which is a sort of love story set in the 1970s in Northern Ireland. I will talk about those books in more detail and what I thought of them in an upcoming video. But until then, just hold your horses and I'll get back to you So those were all the books that I read in March. Let me know what you've been reading. I'm guessing quite a few people will be on the Women's Prize train at the moment, so maybe you've read some of the same books as me lately. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit the subscribe button and you'll see more of my content. I do aim to do one video a week. Thanks very much for watching, and until next time, toodles!